Well, I hope that everybody's had a good weekend. I know that for those of us who've been involved in the weekend together, it's been really fun. It was nice to hear some of the highlights. Mine was probably the hog roast, or on the Friday night, seeing just how competitive people got when it came to dipping digestive biscuits into boiling water. There were some controversial decisions made on the Friday night, apparently. It's been a great weekend, and we've enjoyed lots of things, the teaching, the games, the hog roast. It's been great. But I do have some bad news, some really bad news. I hate to burst the bubble, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but I have some bad news. Tomorrow is Monday, and the weekend will be over. Tomorrow is another Monday morning, and all that means for us. The weekend will be over, and we return to all that we've momentarily paused for a couple days, whether that's returning to work or caring for the kids or looking after relatives or just not quite knowing what to do with yourself. I actually read this morning that the average person, whoever that may be, apparently doesn't smile on a Monday morning until 11:16 a.m. Now, I have no idea how that's measured. It feels oddly specific. And in my case, I definitely don't smile until at least about 12 o'clock, around lunchtime. But apparently, that's the case. And I think it does serve to illustrate what lots of us tend to feel about Mondays. Now, maybe you're much chirpier than me, and you're looking forward to the week ahead. Maybe you've got good things to look forward to. But we all, in one way or another, have experienced that kind of post-camp blues. You know, we've had a great weekend together. It's been really fun. Maybe you feel buoyed on in the faith. There's kind of been this spiritual high, and then the inevitable slump comes when all of it ends. That kind of inner enthusiasm you might have felt for the things of God soon fades when the kind of everyday creeps back in. And so the question comes, how do we endure? Like, how do we keep going on in the faith? And especially so when Monday doesn't just mark the return to the mundane stuff, but also the really hard stuff. The difficult situations you've been able to put aside for a momentary weekend. Those unresolved family tensions, the school bullies, the chronic pain, the looming diagnosis, the dying loved ones. How do we endure, particularly when suffering rears its ugly head? It's a critical question, it's a crucial question for all of us, one that we will all ask at some point or another in our lives. Perhaps you're asking it right now, if you feel like you're in the middle of something, in the middle of a storm. Before working for Grace Church, I spent 5 years working alongside students, helping them to answer difficult questions about life and the Christian faith. But whatever the topic we were discussing, there was one question that was always sure to come up, and that was the question of suffering. But I did notice over that time that something subtly started to shift and change. The very nature of the question being asked began to change. People would ask about God and suffering no longer from a position of kind of philosophical pontificating or even an experiential one of how do I find and make sense of meaning in the midst of all this. But people began asking, how do I simply get through? How do I endure the difficulties that are coming my way? The question about suffering was no longer a why suffering exists or what suffering is, but just how. And how does belief in your God help me to endure? Well, this morning, I hope from the passage that Stu read for us, we're going to see three kind of postures, or rather principles, to help us all endure. Now, it won't be exhaustive, but I hope something helpful in what we see. We're going to see three things. Firstly, suffering is real. Secondly, suffering exposes our character. And thirdly, suffering causes us to embrace weakness. Well, firstly, suffering is real. Now, that might seem like a very obvious thing to say, especially if you're in the midst of something right now. But I think it's worth saying, as we'll see. See, if you've been with us throughout our series in 2 Corinthians, then you may immediately sense, as Stu read the passage for us, that Paul's kind of tone changes quite a bit in this passage. Stu kind of really drove it up for us. He turns up the irony and he turns up the sass, we could say. See, remember that the church in Corinth are being swayed by false teachers who are turning people away from the gospel that Paul has taught them. And throughout his letter, Paul has been imploring the church in Corinth not to reject his message, not to treat him as a fool, as the false teachers are saying they ought to do. These false teachers, their message is one of kind of living your best life now, in contrast to Paul, who just looks weak and weary. And why would anybody believe what he has to say? But he kind of says in this passage, if we're going to treat him as a fool, if the people are going to reject his message, then at least let him play along. At least let him act like one. He's going to kind of play the so-called super apostles at their own game to make a point. And he really turns up the sass and goes toe-to-toe with the false teachers in Corinth. The false teachers are going to boast about how great they are, so let Paul at least boast a little bit. Because in reality, in thinking they're wise, the Corinthians have actually walked into a trap of the overly authoritarian leaders. They're being enslaved and exploited by the false message that the false teachers are presenting, unaware of the damage that is actually being done. You see, in saying that Christians ought to be living their best life now, the false teachers are actually denying the very reality of the world we live in, one that is cursed and full of sin and sickness. By saying that suffering can be avoided, they are actually denying the very fabric of reality. And so their teaching and what they're saying, as good as it may sound to people, is actually completely unlivable. When I read it, I can't help but think of, if you've seen Friends, if you're a fan of Friends, the episode where Joey, we're having a competition about who can hold the breath the longest. And Joey is convinced that he can hold his breath longer than anybody else, and he goes and breathes in until Phoebe comes along later and just pinches his nose and realizes, he's been breathing through his nose that whole time. I feel like Paul is coming along and it's like he's pinching the nose of the false teachers, showing them that the theology that they are espousing is completely unlivable. They can't do it. And so in a sense, Paul, by dialing up the irony, is coming along and he's showing them how foolish they are, showing them the folly of their theology, that what they have to say is unlivable. Their denial of suffering, far from helping the Corinthians endure, is actually causing them to be exploited and manipulated. Paul's comment at the end of the paragraph is really cheeky. Having been accused of being too weak, he kind of shrugs his shoulders and goes, yeah, you're right, I am too weak. Too weak to do what these false teachers are doing to you. Too weak to take you captive. Too weak to slap you in the face. He's unwilling to lord it over others, even though he of all people perhaps could have done so. And it's a sign of the authenticity of his message that he doesn't feel he has to wrestle people into belief by showing off how great he is. He kind of says that if a contest was to take place, then Paul carries on that as a Hebrew, he counts himself as an equal with the false teachers. His credentials are as good as theirs. He has, if not better, he has the right heritage, the right lineage. If the false teachers want to play top trumps, then he will match them every step of the way. But on one category, the one difference, when he says, when it comes to being a servant of Christ, I am much more. He holds the winning hand as it is. But not because of how great his stats are, but because of the suffering that he has undergone as he serves Christ. And boy, has he suffered as he goes on to list what he's been through. The suffering, if you notice as it was read out, is all-encompassing. On land and at sea, in the city, elsewhere, from enemies and those who pretend to be on his side. Physical pain, emotional misery, existential anguish. He's tasted it all. And crucially, he doesn't try and pretend otherwise. I think that's why it's important to start here with this first point, to say that suffering is real and that we shouldn't try and pretend otherwise. See, if we want to endure, the first thing we have to do is recognize that suffering is real. The first hallmark of endurance, or the first principle for us, is recognizing that we do live in a sin-stained world full of suffering. And so any theology or philosophy that cannot reckon with the world we live in and provide us with the resources to cope is not worth its weight in salt. They might appear attractive, but they're actually hollow. Now, you might be sat there and you might be thinking, well, you know what? I don't think that suffering is non-existent. Like, trust me, I know that suffering is real. If only you knew what I was going on. I think, yes, I don't think any of us would perhaps be that obtuse to say that suffering does not exist or is not real. But sometimes, perhaps our words and our actions might actually suggest otherwise. When a friend is suffering or going through something difficult, what are we most prone to say? If we manage to say anything at all, if we don't clam up and get awkward. We say, it'll be okay. No, it will get better. It's going to be okay. We mean well, but actually what we're doing is we're sweeping that suffering under the carpet. We're trying to ignore it and say, actually, no, it's not as real as you think it is. Our British stoicism and stiff upper lip just says, carry on. And in a sense, we deny the reality of suffering as we try and sweep it under the carpet. Just carry on, just ignore it. Well, what if that just might not be possible? And what if things just don't get better? See, we live in a period of history in which much suffering has been and can be alleviated by advances in technology, in medicine and science, which might subtly just reinforce the idea that we will one day just rid ourselves of suffering completely. See, I don't think, and it means that we've just lost a category for being able to talk about suffering altogether. See, I don't think it's a coincidence that as Western culture has lost the category of sin, we've also lost the categories to help people deal with suffering. Or if you've grown up in an Eastern culture, perhaps you're familiar with the idea of we need to transcend our sufferings, move beyond them, rising above it. Well, in each case, the reality of suffering is ultimately kind of dimmed and minimized and suppressed. No, if we're to endure, we must first recognize the reality of sin and suffering in the world. Paul tastes it, and he actually expects that we all will suffer, that suffering will come for us all at one time or another, especially as Christians as we seek to serve Christ in this fallen world. So firstly, suffering is real. But secondly, suffering exposes our character. And we'll see two things here. See, despite all the hardships that Paul has faced, do you notice that the list of everything that he says that he's endured, do you notice the thing that still concerns him the most? He says it's the faith of others. Not his own situation or even their situation, but others, their spiritual condition. He's concerned about others and where they are, where they stand with Christ. Despite everything that he's been through, everything that he's endured, he remains other person focused in the midst of his own affliction. He remains outward looking. And he seems to say that it's knowledge of his own weakness that leads him to consider others. So much so that he will boast in his weakness rather than any perceived strength that he might have. Now, we've got to understand this isn't some kind of fake humility on the part of Paul. He isn't trying to do himself down and dumb down his experiences to make other people feel better. He isn't emphasizing the bleak things he's gone through to kind of puff other people up, make them, it'll be okay. But rather, he's saying how the suffering that he has faced has caused him to care all the more for the spiritual health of the churches that he's served. And he illustrates it by this embarrassing event when he flees persecution in an undignified way by fleeing one of the kings. Like, remember when he shares that story, this is a man who at one time in his life used to pursue and persecute Christians. I'm pretty sure Paul could probably hold himself in a fight. And yet he shares a story of him being lowered in a basket, running away from persecution. He tells this slightly demeaning and embarrassing escape to emphasize just how weak he really is. I think we know, don't we, that it's all too tempting during periods of suffering to turn in on ourselves. It's easy to become bitter and conceited. We turn in on ourselves and our own needs. But Paul's emphasis is to say, his example is that we ought to remain focused on the needs of others. The sins of others cause him to burn inwardly. And the situation, the spiritual health of us cause him to burn inwardly. And why isn't that the case for us? Why do we turn inwardly when suffering strikes? Like a turtle retreating its head back into its shell. I think it's largely for self-protection, isn't it? We try to insulate ourselves against the world, and without realizing it, we can often just push people away. We turn inwardly rather than trusting ourselves to God and to the help of others. And why don't we burn inwardly when other people, and we see our friends and our brothers and sisters led into a sin? Why doesn't it just kind of grieve us inside as much as it ought to? I'm just going to assume that's the case. Because perhaps if we're honest, in the same way that kind of TV soap operas still kind of draw in mass audiences at Christmas, as you kind of watch destruction play out in other people's lives to kind of boost our own egos and feel better about our own Christmases, perhaps sometimes, if we're honest, we kind of revel in the sin of others as a way of kind of boosting our own egos. It makes us feel a bit more powerful and righteous when we see other people messing up and slipping up. See, rather than burning inwardly, we can kind of tut and wag our finger. And it's the complete opposite of what Paul says, and how an example for us. See, ultimately, we're not grieved by other people's sin because we're not grieved by our own. And that's why we must reckon with this sin-cursed world that we live in. That's why we started there. Because it isn't just that sin is out there, but it's also in here as well. Paul continues his ironic boasting by moving on from the way he has served and suffered to visions and revelations from the Lord. See, if the super apostles want to play top trumps, then he's going to remind them who he is, all right? He's an apostle. And the message that he shares has been directly revealed to him by God. Like he met Jesus face to face. That's something that the false teachers can't dare to match. And you have to admit, okay, in this section, he takes a slightly confusing tone here in chapter 12, 1-7. And at first glance, it kind of looks like he's talking about somebody else, some random guy that he met 14 years ago. But I think he's talking about himself. He so wants to distance himself from any claims of strength that he speaks of himself in the third person. It has to be him, otherwise he wouldn't know about the inexpressible things, and verse 1 and verse 6 kind of make it clear that he's talking about himself. But what he's doing is he's refraining from swaggering about, sharing about his experiences so that no one will think more of me than is warranted by what I do or say, or because of these surpassingly great revelations. You see, even as he's taking the false teachers to town, even as he's schooling them, he's not doing so to try and make himself look superior. Notice how he's not appealing to the Corinthians to trust him because of who he is and what he's achieved, but they should trust him precisely because he's so weak in contrast to the super apostles. He remains humble. He so emphasizes the importance of humility that he says, he was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger from Satan to torment me. It's kind of a famous verse, and many people are still unsure exactly what is being referred to when he talks about the thorn in his flesh. It could be that he suffers some kind of physical ailment, or it's kind of spiritual opposition. But whatever the case, the imagery is stark. What is clear is that Paul sees his sufferings as a means by which he has been kept humble by God. And so ultimately, it is for his good, as difficult as it is for him. That's not that we should seek suffering or never long to be free from it. In the next verse, Paul says that he pleads with the Lord to take away his suffering. But what he is saying is that he continues to trust God despite his circumstances, despite the difficult things he's going through. Now, why might we be tempted kind of not to humble ourselves when suffering strikes? Well, I think we're encouraged, aren't we, all the time to rally against our circumstances, to kind of take control and change your life for the better. We're encouraged to rally against the dying light. Our initial response is often to, like I said, to seize some control, or to say that, do you know what, the experiences and the circumstances I'm going through, they're just not fair. And that's another way of saying, I just don't deserve this. I deserve better than this. I think what Paul has to say is really challenging. It's really countercultural. He says, yes, suffering really sucks, and I long for it to end, But I trust that the sovereign God who works all things for my good, even when I really can't see how that could possibly be. Yes, suffering is rubbish, and I long for it to end, but I trust our good God who works all things for my good, even when I can't really see how that's possible. I think that's tough to swallow. But if the question is, how do we endure, then I think that's ultimately more livable. To live with that tension, that seeming tension, that God could change my circumstances, but he hasn't. The alternative is to say that suffering is either meaningless or is just my fault. Like neither of those help. The truth is that the existence of God and the reality of suffering may leave us with questions. If we were to write it out as an equation, we sometimes do this with youth, we write these things out as an equation. But if we were to subtract God from that equation, well, we're still left with suffering and we're still left with lots of questions. And now we're left with no means to make sense of why we're asked the questions in the first place, and we're left with no resource to keep us and help us to endure. See, Paul's belief in God's providence over his circumstances is what keeps him humble and is what keeps him going. Suffering exposes our character, and Paul reminds us to remain other-focused and humble. If we are to endure, we must recognize the reality of sin and then rally against it. True endurance means rallying against our sin more than our own circumstances, even in the midst of grueling suffering. We need to fight the tendency to turn in on ourselves and instead remain humble and other-focused, despite what we might be going through. But how do we do that? It's all good and well saying that, but how? All right? How do we do that? Well, thirdly, suffering causes us to embrace weakness. I think it's no coincidence that in the section in verse 8 to 10, Paul mentions that he pleads with God 3 times. 3 times he pleads with God to take away the suffering that he's enduring. And I think it's purposeful. I think he's trying to cast our minds back to Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane, to Jesus, the one who pleaded with God the Father 3 times to let the cup pass by him, but then ultimately says, "Not my will, but yours be done." See, Paul is an example to us because he is following Christ's example. That's why weakness has been such a key theme throughout the whole of his letter and throughout his life as he ministers the gospel. Because Jesus is the epitome of power displayed in weakness. From being born in obscurity to dying his horrific death. See, from the outside looking in, his life and ministry looked extraordinarily weak. Yet we know this is true power. That God would choose to become weak. It is through this greatest act of weakness as Jesus becomes human and hangs on a tree and dies for the sins of the world so that we might be redeemed and welcomed into a relationship with God. That is where true power lies. The cross looks weak to those who don't understand its significance, but to all who believe, it's the greatest act of power possible. See, grace is powerful. And now that same power rests on those who gladly throw themselves into the arms of Christ. All who would admit their weakness and need for his all-sufficient grace. It is in and through weakness that we come to know Jesus for ourselves, admitting our sin and our inability to earn God's favor and our need to rely on his grace. See, it's a bit of a cheesy saying that gets bounded about, but you see, but it rings true that weakness is the way in and the way on in the Christian life. We come to Christ weak, confessing our sin and need for him, but we so often subtly might think that once we've done that, we're clear. We're finished and we move on to kind of mightier things. But that's not the pattern of the Christian life that Paul spells out for us. We remain weak, dependent on God in all circumstances, reliant on God's grace to see us through. We never graduate on from grace. See, we're not only, what I think Paul is saying, we're not only saved by grace, but we're also sustained by grace also for the rest of our lives. The Christian life is inherently weak, and Paul's ministry is no different. Paul's theology is completely countercultural for us here, as we've said. But we just can't help but try and avoid appearing weak. We do everything we can to not look weak in front of others. It's not high on the list of how I want other people to think of me. We would much rather want to appear impressive or competent, well put together, well-rounded. But suffering smashes through any facade that we may build up for ourselves. When suffering comes, we realize just how weak and finite we really are. We're not as strong. We realize we're not as strong as we pretend or hope to be. Suffering brings us to our knees and to the end of ourselves so that we might throw ourselves on Christ and rely on his powerful grace. Therefore, Paul says, he will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me, and he will delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecution, in difficulties. If not for the gospel, Paul sounds like a right weirdo here. Like a right weirdo. It just doesn't make sense apart from the gospel. He says that he gladly boasts in how weak he is, and he delights in his weaknesses. Like, to be clear, Paul isn't saying that if you're having a tough time, you just need to paper a smile over your face, or even that suffering is somehow enjoyable. That would make him a weirdo. That would be weird. But he is saying that he knows joy even in the midst of his sufferings. In those moments of rejection, of persecution, of the thorn in his flesh, he knows more truly just how reliant he is on Christ. And as he realizes how reliant he is on Christ's all-sufficient grace, he sees how God is upholding him and sustaining him in every moment, with every breath that he takes. Paul is convinced that suffering causes us to embrace Christ, so that Christ's power may be displayed. And that is where true joy is found also. And that's why he can delight. The author of Narnia and one-time professor in Oxford, C.S. Lewis, once said that we can ignore even pleasure, but pain insists upon being attended to. God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. See, as hard as it may first seem, God may use suffering so that we realize our weakness and so embrace Christ all the more. Yet in doing so, he always supplies sufficient grace to then carry us through those troubles. He empowers us to endure and even provides joy in the midst of the pain. It is remaining close to Christ that will see us through life's difficulties. You see, enduring ultimately means boasting in our weakness so that Christ's power may be displayed. Because it's Jesus, isn't it? It's Jesus is the one who endured the reality of suffering. He came down into this sin-cursed world and suffered for us. And throughout his life, he is the one who remains utterly other-focused and humble. The suffering he endured only ever exposed his perfect sinlessness. And ultimately, he is the one who embraced weakness so that he might embrace us. He is the one who causes us to endure. His grace is sufficient for you, whatever you might be going through. Let's pray. Father, we're so aware that we can kind of just gristle whenever we talk about suffering. We can find these things hard to grasp and understand. I've certainly been challenged whilst preparing this, how you could possibly use all things for the good of those who love you. But we're sorry for the times when we doubt your goodness. And so we ask, please would you remind us afresh today how good you are, how kind you are. And Father, please help us to trust in you whatever we're going through in this moment. Father, I pray for my brothers and sisters that are currently going through a tough time. Please, would you comfort them by your Spirit, and would you take away what they're going through? But if not, help them still to praise you, and help us all to boast in our weakness so that Christ's power may be displayed. It's in his name that we pray. Amen.